Thank you for having me. I don't get that many opportunities to speak as I did when I was on the cover of Time magazine. What do they say? Fleeting fame lasts for 10 seconds or something like that. Warhol had a thing, and well, it's about right. In many ways, that's good, but my problem, and of course, whistleblowing also has undergone a big transformation. In 2002, it was the year of the whistleblower for Time. And the whistleblower for Enron and the whistleblower for WorldCom, which were both financial scandals, frauds. They were both women, too, and the three of us were on the cover together. Now, these many years later, where there have been a number of other whistleblowers that have come out of the woodwork, most recently Edward Snowden with the NSA, that term is really not seen very favorably by and large. In fact, under the Obama administration, it's considered to be a form of espionage. There's an old 1917 Espionage Act. It was called Espionage and Sedition, 1918, because in World War I, in trying to reduce the number of people dissenting against the war, etc., they passed these draconian laws. But even then, they were believed to only apply to true spies, like somebody who would go to the enemy and sell secrets or troop movements or something like that. In Vietnam, there was a whistleblower by the name of Daniel Ellsberg who gave these Pentagon Papers to 19 different newspapers, and Nixon was really focused on winning the Vietnam War, and he believed that he had to keep it going. He was ramping up secret bombing at the time, all kinds of things, and did not want these Pentagon Papers for the public to see them at all costs. So they got court orders. The Department of Justice actually stopped the presses, or tried to stop the presses. And Ellsberg went from one newspaper to another. Eventually there were 18 or 19 newspapers that published them. They defied Nixon's orders, and then it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court at the time held that you can't stop the presses ahead of time. So that was really this strong precedent. So in the meantime, most everyone thought that using the Espionage Act, as they tried to with Ellsberg, would be an encroachment on freedom of press. And so to use it in this way, well, other people would say, yeah, but there's really nothing that stops it, because it does apply not only to the whistleblower and this theory of stealing information, but it even applies to the newspaper publishing it. And so you get, recently, about a year ago, what came to light with a Fox News reporter named Rosen, who had published some information about North Korea. And Rosen, who was a Fox reporter, was called a co-conspirator. And now there's been Mike Rogers, the head of the House Intelligence Committee, has called for Glenn Greenwald to be prosecuted, and other reporters. So freedom of press is really on the line. And what I'm trying to say is whistleblowing is not the same. They're on eight prosecutions now of leakers under this 1917 Espionage Act. A couple of them haven't been successful, but for instance, even the CIA agent who released the information about torture, nobody's been prosecuted for torture, but the whistleblower who released the information about it is still in prison. So this has really greatly changed since 2002. Things have changed, and I will contend it's because of the war situation, because every time you have wars going on, that's when these sedition-type laws, martial law, and even in the Civil War, they had these draconian law of war where you couldn't even criticize the president. You were seen as being disloyal, and they jailed editors, etc. Certainly World War I. So here we are all these years later, and I think what we need more of course, is speaking about these issues and getting more information out for the public to understand. I'm going to talk about the narrow focus of the NSA, but really, when I say NSA, I'm not limited. It's the whole intelligence agencies, all of the community. There's 16 agencies, and they all have different programs virtually very similar to the NSA's. The NSA's is the biggest one, but the FBI has programs too. There's not been a whistleblower yet about the CIA or the NSA programs. So I'll talk about what we know about the NSA. they say that we're finally having a debate. When Obama gave his speech, he said, well, finally, I mean, this was considered the little bit of, kudos that the whistleblower Edward Snowden gets about the revelations of this spying on people and mass collecting of data. A little bit of kudos is, well, he's a bad guy, he stole this information, it was things we didn't need to know, but at least it started a debate. Okay, so even House people that want to prosecute Snowden will say that. The truth is, actually, we had a debate on this topic. And, again, we have such short attention spans, but in 2003, Poindexter, who was what was his background again, Poindexter? He was convicted of a felony in connection with the Iran-Contra. Yeah, Iran-Contra. So, but he's, they never die, they keep going around. So Poindexter later got a position in government, and he's working with DARPA, Defense, I can't give you the whole name, but DARPA, you can, it's the research arm of the Pentagon. And he came up with this total information awareness as a title. Now, what probably the public didn't know is it was already going on. DARPA initiated this without a debate. It was already going on. Poindexter floated it publicly to see how people would take to this idea. And their icon was this pyramid with the all-seeing eye. And the thought was, we will collect all information as much as we can get from every source on everyone. At the time, there was a lot of talk about developing, for human intelligence, developing the mailman as your informant. And so the mailmen, postal people, know a lot about where people live, etc. They would make great informants if that's what you cared about, collecting information on what kind of mail people were receiving. But that was actually talked about as being one of the avenues. But they were going to change people into being informants on other people. That was part of it. But also collecting by all means possible. So for a while, when this was first floated, people went, what? I mean, and if you consider that 2003-4, this was when the United States was probably most traumatized. That was much closer to 9/11. So there was still a lot of trauma from this. So the most likely time when people would have accepted total information awareness was probably at that time. That's why it got floated. In fact, people were not cool with it. The total information awareness was debated a little bit, and Congress defunded it. And then everyone said, well, thank goodness we're not doing that. But here's what happened. It didn't stop it. Nothing stopped because they defunded the total information awareness. The names of some of the programs they're all cute little acronym type names that, some of them are cuter than others. They sit in closed doors and come up with these names. But there are thousands of these programs. So far, Edward Snowden's documents have revealed 238 different main disclosures. And you've probably heard PRISM and the telephone metadata collection, but they all have cute names. When I used to give this talk before the Snowden disclosures, I did write chapters about this, because even before Snowden's disclosures came out, people knew what was going on. The Washington Post researched this in 2010 and wrote thousands front-page articles called Top Secret America. They had pretty much the same information, and they were getting it from anonymous sources, mostly anonymous sources, and they did a real good job of researching it. So, this stuff was known that this was going on, and I used to go through these. I used to have a list of all the cute names that had been coming up, and I don't remember them all, but one of them was kind of something I remember because it describes what the purpose and the selling of this. This was an NSA one, it was called Novel Intelligence from Massive Data. And this wasn't a secret thing, but if you think about it, how many people would want to know something new and different, novel intelligence, from collecting massive data? So it's selling that you can do this. Well, the truth is, when they did the Academy of Sciences researchers and high-tech people that have looked at this, they've never found that it's possible to collect massive amounts of data and somehow connect the dots. My memo itself in 2002 was about 9/11. That was the problem. There was stovepiping of information. and lack of sharing of information, not inside agencies in some case. The Minnesota case here, there was a terrorist that was connected to the other 19, and that information actually stopped inside the FBI. It only got to the mid-level management. Even though people in Paris knew because the agents had set out leads, it stopped in the FBI at the mid-level management level because it was a stovepiping inside the agency. Then the other buddy got briefed to George Tenet, who was the head of the Director of Central Intelligence of all 16 agencies at the time. He got a PowerPoint about Moussaoui, and he didn't do anything with the information. There were cases of memos, explicit memos, later covered up that said Osama bin Laden, I'm not talking about the presidential one, I'm talking about one that was in the FBI, that said Osama bin Laden is going to attack. This was in April of 2001, 5 months beforehand, and he's entwined with the Chechen terrorist Ibn Khattab. That memo was to 8 or 9 of our assistant directors who claimed they never saw it. So when you have the 9/11, how many people have read the 9/11 Commission report? Does anyone remember reading parts of that at least? The 8th chapter is called "The System Was Blinking Red," and it's about all of this stovepiping where the directors, like Tenet and Richard Clark, were said to have their hair on fire. They were getting so many warnings and intelligence this summer of 2001. And in fact, 2 of the hijackers had been followed by the CIA, and they knew they had come into California. There was all this information. And so, it either wasn't read at all, or if it was read, it wasn't shared properly with the other agencies, or even if it was shared, as the case of the Minnesota case was shared with DCI Tenet, nothing was done. Tenet just shrugs about, it wasn't my job. He was the DCI, but he said it wasn't his job to do anything further, other than being briefed. Some of the intelligence people at the time gave the excuse, one of the excuses for not reading, not sharing, and not acting on what they already knew, the warnings they were getting, was intelligence is like a fire hose. It's pouring through so much, so fast, so hard, you can't get a sip from a fire hose. And more than one gave that excuse. Okay, if you think about that, that's true. If you can't even hold the fire hose, well, how can you possibly get a sip? There's so much, and there's so much coming in, you don't know what's important. Now, here's the thing. The 9/11 report took 3 years to make. And in the meantime, right after 9/11, they turned on, that fire hose became Niagara Falls, and then it became a tsunami. So if it was too hard to get a sip from a fire hose, and now you've magnified it by saying, we're going to collect everything on everybody, how could that possibly have been the solution? It's just the opposite of what the problem was. The problem was people did not, read the important stuff. Or couldn't make sense of what they were getting. Is there any aspiring criminal justice, law enforcement person in the audience? Or even a lawyer, if you want to go to law school? This will become very important. And at least in the old days, everything's changed now, but this is really what the criminal justice system consists of. There are levels of information, evidence that you have to have, and it's all called under the rubric of due process. The FBI or your police department is not omniscient. They have to look at if a murder occurs or if a crime occurs, whoever, they're all suspects. Everyone's looked at as a possible suspect, but without any specific evidence or information, you are really at the very bottom level. When you have no level at all of suspicion, there's not much you can do, because as you, as a police officer, become more intrusive on people's rights, you have to have a greater amount of predication for what you're doing. That's our whole system of due process that goes back at least 800 years and longer than that. What you can do with no level is you can look at open source. In the old days with the war on drugs, they did profile, so they could weed people out based on race. Profiling was completely legal and done up until about 2002. Bush then put a restriction on racial profiling for purposes of drugs. But by and large, And the exemption for that was the war on terror. So they've always been able to profile based for terrorist purposes. But you can data mine whatever your sources are. You can't do too much that's intrusive. Then the other thing is tips will come in. So for instance, in a bank robbery, if a bank robbery occurs, everybody's a suspect, but if you got a photo of the bank robber, you put it out on the television, then you would maybe get some calls in, and maybe you get 4 or 5 calls and they're all different people because the person looked like 4 different people. Well, at least now you have something. At least you have a tip. So you can go to this next level. Unfortunately, color-coded alerts, which have now been dropped right after 9/11, everybody was calling it on their neighbors and because people were scared and they told everyone it was an orange alert. And when the anthrax was going on right after 9/11, our phones were lit up because everybody spotted white powder. And it was just a completely human nature fear thing. Well, from the standpoint of the investigator, we really was waste, everybody's running around looking for white powder, running to McDonald's and looking at flour on the floor, etc. I'm not kidding. This scare thing. So it was realized this was dumb. And the other reason that the color-coded alerts were dumb was because once you went to orange, you could never tell the terrorists you were going back to green. And people were afraid to go to red because that red meant that you actually were under some kind of terrible attack. So it was like basically we were stuck in orange forever. So eventually they just decided to drop that, which was insane. You go up to the next higher level and you have very well known under the law, reasonable suspicion. It's more than a hunch. And under the old guidelines that existed before 9/11, what you could do if you had reasonable suspicion is you could open an inquiry. You weren't even able to investigate somebody without a reasonable suspicion. You had to have something that you could predicate. You just couldn't go out and investigate willy-nilly. You had to have something. And under this old guidelines, you could do all tactics except for electronic surveillance and mail covers. A mail cover is just looking at the outside of the envelope. Okay? Think about what's going on right now with collecting everything. I mean, if you think about the difference between the law and what happened afterwards, it's so amazing. And I know a lot of young people, in my case, I taught these things to FBI agents, and if you messed up on any of these things, if you stopped somebody saying that you had reasonable suspicion, and later a court says there's no reason for you to have stopped this person, detained them, let's say a bank robber, and then somebody, you found the evidence, they actually would throw out the evidence. So that's the way the criminal justice system worked, and it was very important to know how this due process system worked, or you could lose cases in court before 9/11. So you get to this level, and you could do something. Now the next level, which I always like to make that bigger, this is kind of like also a triangle, because as you're going up, you're weeding out people, and you're getting more and more evidence and information. The main one that everyone knows is probable cause. That's what's used in the Fourth Amendment. And it means more likely than not. Well, when you have probable cause, when you reach that level, you can indict someone, you can arrest someone, and actually you can then monitor people. In the 1980s, I worked in New York City, and that was when we were going after the mafia and the mob in New York City. And I listened in, those movies, Goodfellas and Godfather and all this. I listened in to mob figures for 2 years and then transcribed horrible, vulgar conversations about whacking people and really bad language for court. And we played those tapes later on, and most of the head hierarchy of the mob in New York got convicted in the 80s. In fact, some of the people that later became the well-known people in terrorism, like Chertoff and Rudy Giuliani, were the people that had their very first big case was the mob cases in the 1980s. So, but to do that, to show a judge would have to sign off. Those affidavits that proved that you had probable cause were about 100 pages long. And it usually took agents a minimum of a year of investigation, sometimes 2 years, in order to get enough information that you would convince a judge that you're going to violate a mob guy's privacy in order to listen in. Okay, look at what's going on now. I mean, it's just a complete stark contrast. After probable cause, you get to the next highest thing, which is called proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And this is what a jury has to find in order to convict you, and actually then, yes, significantly impair your freedom because you're going to go to jail. That's a pretty high level. It doesn't mean, by the way, that lots of mistakes don't get made. Juries make mistakes and convict innocent people, especially before DNA existed, etc. There were lots of we even had a case of a bank robber in Minnesota who was in jail and finally convicted by a jury, and he served 4 months before the real bank robber, who was a complete lookalike for the innocent guy. They were very close looking, and even the innocent man who had served 4 months was identified by his friends. Not only the tellers, he was even identified by people who knew him. So eyewitness identifications are very followable. So anyways, you can even get to this point of being convicted beyond a reasonable doubt and still have a fault in the system. But at least this system makes sense, because as you're giving up some liberties there, it requires a higher level of evidence, a higher level of justification. The final one up there, little tiny words, is throw away the key. That's when all of your appeals have been exhausted, so judges review the case to make sure it's all been fair. So it's kind of like a triangle, and that's what our system is supposed to be. And we were talking beforehand, if this war on terror is being described as an exercise in policing, it's not actually targeted, it's not two countries at war with each other. It's more of a policing effort on the part of the FBI to get the terrorists, which could be scattered throughout the world. Well, then we ought to have a very fair, above-board, hundreds of years that have existed, that have honed this process, something like the process that we've used all the time. So, I don't know if you can read all these, but this was a cartoon that came out after the Top Secret America series appeared. And these are the two, NSA, CIA, overweight, drinking their coffee, looking at their great board with all of their connections with there's around 2,000 private contractors now in the national security intelligence field. And then there's about 800, there's a lot of little agencies, people don't even know the names. There's the big ones, 16 big ones, but there's a lot of little smaller ones. So they put up joke ones like LOL, laugh out loud is one, and POTUS, and this one, Skiff, is in there somewhere. Skiff is the place you go into that is all lead covered, that you can be secret. So if our congresspersons are allowed to see one of the white papers, they actually go into this lead thing that's got minor, people are watching you in there, that there's a code to get in. It's just like in the movies. And these skiffs now are lots and lots of places. Anyways, there's one of them that says Skiff. And one says to the other, that's nice chart we got there, but who actually catches the terrorists? And then the other guy says, well, maybe an alert t-shirt vendor. Most of the terrorist attacks, whether somewhat successful, partially successful, or have been thwarted, were caught by the public. Abdul Muttalib, the underwear guy who does set his underwear on fire on the plane, was stopped by fellow passengers. Richard Reed, right after 9/11, was stopped by fellow passengers. The vendors, the street vendors, stopped the bomb that was placed in Times Square. Shahzad was his name. Even the Sarnoff brothers, who weren't stopped, were found by, after they called off this heightened, clamp down on all of Boston, and they let people out of their houses, the guy went out and spotted the one brother. So it actually was a member of the public that caught him. 3 of these cases were close connections in the metadata. The Abdul Muttalib, Shahzad, and Hassan, the shooter at Fort Hood, were reported to all be in direct contact with al-Awlaki, who we later said was the top terrorist. And al-Awlaki was said to have been in contact with the terrorist hijackers. Okay? So if this metadata was working, it should certainly have caught 3 people that were just 2 degrees of connection. Not 3 or 4 or 5 as, there were just 2 degrees or 1 or 2 degrees of connection, if it worked. So there's good reason to believe that this doesn't work at all. And that that nobody wants to tell the members of the public that, if you actually have a crime occur, you're going to be the first person there. In a bank robbery, the teller, unfortunately, almost never the police are going to get to it in time. The teller is aware that if you're a teller, that you might have a bank robbery occur in your bank. So you're prepared for it, and there's what you're supposed to do, etc. Because the police, if they can drive really fast, they're not going to get there in time. And that's pretty much the way most crimes are. This idea that you can prevent a crime ahead of time simply by collecting whatever is crazy. It's absolutely not possible. Okay, so these are some quotes that are, principles actually. And one of them is about secrecy. Lord Acton was well known for power corrupts, but people don't know what he said about secrecy. We now believe, because we get speeches about it all the time, about how governmental secrecy is to protect us. And as long as you don't know what the government is doing, you're going to be safer. I mean, that's kind of what's said all the time. And that's why whistleblowing is wrong. The truth is, secrecy is absolutely pernicious. And it's pernicious in many, many ways. The plane that was able to fight back and stop that plane from hitting someplace in Washington was only because they knew what had gone on before. That's the only reason they had that little bit of extra information that the other 2 planes didn't have. And so information, and of course, if you're talking about secret governmental things that occur, it's always going to be helpful. And it's actually why 9/11 was allowed to occur, is because there wasn't sharing of information. And especially there wasn't sharing of information with the public. So secrecy everything secret will degenerate. One of the reasons why going back to the process I talked about, it almost always worked really well in terms of convicting somebody, is because when you did that 100-page affidavit, you were very careful about crossing the T's and dotting the I's. It was done perfectly because you knew at the end of the investigation it was going to be handed to a defense attorney, and then you were going to have to be on a witness stand, raising your right hand and be grilled about it. And so it was only a temporary secrecy. So if you have only a period of time, necessary temporary secrecy, and you know that it will all be public, people will naturally be much more careful, and you won't have any of the very few problems. On the other hand, if you are told, as now exists with the total information awareness / total secret America, you're told that it's perpetual secrecy, then there's very little safeguard there, because people will, unfortunately, at the very least, get sloppy and careless, even if they aren't trying deliberately to do things. Many commentators have said this isn't a potential abuse, it is just going to happen, because you can't have secret systems. So one of the main problems is governmental secrecy, has just been expanded. We went, in 1996, there were about 6 million government documents, and that went to 2010 to 92 million documents classified now. It's enormous. I wanted to comment too on Cicero. During times of war, the law falls silent. This is why during the Civil War, during World War I, during Vietnam, all of your encroachments on freedom and liberty occur during wartime, tend to. And even the Cold War, even Joe McCarthy in the Cold War. Because what you're doing is you're telling people that in order to win this war, we have to clamp down on people's freedom of speech, freedom of press. And in fact, after Vietnam, there were many officers who believed that allowing Jane Fonda to speak out and Daniel Ellsberg, allowing the papers to publish the Pentagon Papers, allowing Cronkite to say in 1968 that the war was unwinnable. Many officers believed that's why we lost Vietnam War. In fact, there's been many papers written about this. And so it was always said that the next war, there will be a better job at controlling public opinion than happened during Vietnam. And there's been a strong effort. Well, this happens in every single war. The spying that occurred in the 60s, we just had Martin Luther King's birthday, but he along with 1,650 Americans were targeted by the NSA back in for 6 years. For 6 years at the end of Vietnam War, 1,650 Americans were on the NSA's target list. And to this day, this many years later, when I said perpetual secrecy, to this day, no one knows 1,643 of them. But 7 of the 1,650, just this September, a document was declassified that had 7 of the 1,650 that were in the it's called the Minaret program in the NSA. And the 7 were, everyone knows, Martin Luther King, because he was also the FBI subject under COINTELPRO. They put microphones in his hotel rooms. They wrote him anonymous letters implying that he should commit suicide rather than accept the Nobel Peace Prize. This came from the FBI. This was an anonymous, it was called COINTELPRO. So everyone wasn't surprised to see Martin Luther King on there. Another civil rights leader, Whitney Young, he was on it. A humorist, Art Buchwald. No one can figure out why. He wrote a couple things critical, I guess. You know, he wasn't considered such a critic, but he wrote a couple of things, funny things, and he got on it. An editor from the New York Times, Tom Rooker, was on it. Obviously, he must have written something that rankled everybody. Muhammad Ali, not a surprise. He sought conscientious objector status during Vietnam, so he was put on this list. Now, here's the worst 2 of the 7 that we know. The other 2 were both U.S. senators. Frank Church himself and Howard Baker, who was actually pro-war, was on it. Oh, there could have been other congresspersons and senators on this. So when people say, oh, no one's shown an abuse, that's not true at all. That actually got asked in the Senate Judiciary Committee meeting recently. Someone said, has there ever been abuse? One of the senators asked, and I forget, it was the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. And one of them said, no, we haven't seen any abuse. And then they backed up and they go, you mean ever? You mean just recently? Okay, because as soon as they thought about it, well, there have been abuses in the past. And the CIA had one called Chaos. So there was COINTELPRO, was FBI, Chaos was CIA, and Minaret was NSA for 6 years at the end of the Vietnam War. And of course, again, the thought is that people are, the civil rights people, even feminists were spied on, etc. And they thought, well, we have to stop this dissent in the United States. So, unfortunately, during Cicero, of course, realized this way back in the Roman times. During times of war, the law falls silent. And James Madison, founding fathers, realized that anytime, that's why they made it such a rather strict and difficult requirement to start a war, because they know that it comes blows back. And so the country that starts the war, if they maintain this war, it empowers the executive, because now it's like the tail wagging the dog. All countries out there that have a war, it empowers domestically the leader. So there was lots of things that the founding fathers, and that's why they tried to build this in. All right, so this is what we get into profiling. And I don't know if you can see all these things, but, you know, little old grandmother who's against fracking, and, you know, this is a diagram of all of the suspicious things. She's got a skirt on that's almost vertical length. And her sandals were Middle Eastern style. And, you know, what's under her bun? Maybe it's a bomb. I mean, this is the good thing. And by the way, these cartoonists gave me permission to use their work. I like cartoons because there's an element, it's like Jon Stewart and anything else, there's a lot of truth in this. This is what you can do by massive data collection is, yes, you can target lots of people. And you can, you know, see connections like this. But it doesn't mean that any of them are accurate. In fact, the real terrorists are going to find it easier to hide the bigger the haystack that you are creating. And we actually have 23 anti-war people from Chicago and the Twin Cities that for 3 years now, they got raided over 3 years ago. Their houses, and they got all their records and computers and everything taken, and they've never been charged yet. And their attorneys have said, well, what's going on here? They're trying to get their stuff back and asking for to this day, the affidavit that said that they had probable cause to do this is still secret. They don't even know what was used to could have been things, almost this silly. And one of them is 70, in her 70s. One of the anti-war activists is like she is a grandmother. So, you might know Aaron Schwartz. This was this young man who was for sharing of information, and he did download some archives of articles that he wasn't supposed to. He thought they should be freely shared. These weren't anything secret or anything, but they were just plain old articles. And the Department of Justice is trying to crack down on this, and they threatened him with a few years in prison, in jail for this, and he committed suicide last year. So one of the kind of the rallying cries for having a secure internet and not being spied on and being able to share information, especially creative things, more freely, is Aaron Schwartz. And he was it Harvard or he's MIT. Yeah, very smart, brilliant young man. But he obviously, got scared by me. And he had this quote, "Information is power, but like all power, there are those who want to keep it for themselves." So when people say, why is this happening? Because it isn't serving any purpose. I mean, we're being fed this stuff, but it's not serving it. It is because of power. And it's also because of money. The power and the money are entwined. Lots of people are making money off of this. In the past, countries always spy on other countries. And so, maybe, with regards to treaty negotiation, there's now, one of the revelations is that the U.S. spied on the climate change, these big United Nations conferences. And so here you are, as a diplomat, talking to a UN diplomat, but you know what the UN guy is going to say to you, because you've been spying on him and you've collected all this information. So then you're better prepared. Anybody in debate? So, it'd be like if you're in debate and you get an advantage because you don't even have to prepare. You already know what the guy's going to say. You got his notes ahead of time. So you can imagine how this is very tempting for governments to try to learn what all the other countries out there are doing and saying, because it gives you an advantage, or believed to, in terms of power. I do have a couple more. Why is it not going? I have a few more slides in here. No, that's my family. Huh. Yeah, I don't know if someone there. It's a longer PowerPoint, but maybe it could offer something. What?
Is it still on the other one?
Yeah, if it is. My daughter got her nursing degree. The last slides I had were on the fixes. And I should have printed them all off.
Just
I
need your
don't know if I'll
password.
remember them all, but I certainly remember a lot of them. So recently Obama gave a speech. And the purpose of that speech, unfortunately, I'm a little on the cynical side.
Here we go.
Oh, there we go. Oh. Okay, well, we have another cartoon before we get to the fixes. So this cartoon is pretty, look at the date, 7/18/11. 2 years before anyone ever heard the name Edward Snowden. And it's about, these are the NSA monitors looking into somebody's bedroom, and up pops magically on the screen the entire description of who they're looking at. And, you know, there's Viagra on the nightstand, and the woman is saying, that darn Rupert Murdoch spying on everybody. And then the NSA is looking. Well, this cartoon, amazingly enough, was written 2 years before in the Snowden disclosures. So that guy pretty much had it figured out what was going on pretty closely.
So you have to go to the keyboard
Oh, go.
and just, and now it's not on your laptop anymore.
Oh,
It's
go
on
to this one.
Yep.
Okay, good. Okay, recommendations. Okay, so it's not good enough just to criticize and say, and the massive spine, you know, little signs that we have, and this massive spine. These are really, and I tried just to make them very basic, but these are the things that would make a difference. Obama, he had some very small ideas. One is to take the bulk telephone metadata is just one of many, many programs in the first place. It's a big one, but it's just one. And one of his suggestions, and it came from his review panels, was that the NSA should not hold it. It should either be forced, the telecom companies themselves should be forced to hold it, and then you have to go get that from them afterwards. Maybe you have to tell them to hold it for 5 years. They don't want to do that. They don't want to be forced into this. They're against that. But that was one idea. Or create a whole new agency, a whole new separate thing, instead of the NSA, and have them hold it. That's what Obama, in fact, this was considered the most important one of his suggestions. Well, I know some of the whistleblowers from the NSA, and most of them said this isn't going to do anything. Because the NSA, even if you did develop, unfortunately, it'll cost billions of dollars more to get another entity to hold on. But even if you did that, the first thing the NSA, they like challenges. The first thing they would do is find a way to get that into that deck. And there's no oversight, and there's no whistleblowing. So how are you ever going to be able to tell that this has been fixed? Another one of Obama's suggestions was that he would not be spying on Angela Merkel, because that did create, you know, embarrassment, and Germans got mad about it. But the truth is, if there's no whistleblowing, and there's no oversight, and there's no auditing, and Obama gives a speech and says we'll no longer spy on Angela Merkel, and maybe they won't for a year or two, or maybe the next president, there's no way that anybody will ever know. So there's no fix in there, requiring audit. Most agencies have some kind of mechanism for audit. You know, they do get, the Pentagon maybe doesn't have such a great system of being audited, but most of them do. And so they do periodically get inspected. And another great example are forensic labs. Okay, forensic labs that do a DNA test that is going to put somebody in jail for their life as being a murderer because their DNA was found there. You know what? They get blind tested by independent auditors. And if they don't get blind tested, then they lose their accreditation. That's how, it's very important to have very accurate information on somebody who's doing this. Well, the NSA doesn't have anything like that. So here's some of the recommendations. End the wars. The war itself is leading to this massive spying. They're completely entwined. So without ending the wars, it will be next to impossible to rein in the domestic spying. They're linked, joined at the hips. Okay, going back to my charts. Focus on the bad guys, not the innocent. Stop adding hay to the haystack. Go back to due process, which allows greater intrusiveness upon individuals' freedom only as the level of evidence and judicial certitude increases. I don't think you've got this massive collection where you just, without suspicion, collect it all, and then later think that the computers will sort it out. One other thing is that they're selling this as being able to prevent. What this system can do right now, collecting, there could be hundreds and thousands of records about each individual. So 10 years from now, if you do something, they're going to go back and say, let's just see everything else. So that actually would be at least accurate. So it's after the fact. After the fact, they can go back and on any level, and they can look at a person afterwards. But that's not the way, I mean, that's not, you know, we're getting into what the judge called almost Orwellian at that stage. So the focus system actually works, because then the directors can't say, well, we can't get a step, because the only things being collected are relevant. But the officials now have turned this on its head, and they've said this idea about the haystack, and that if we're looking for a needle in the haystack, you know, how can it help? They add more hay. They testified this summer, FBI second in command testified, if you're going to find a terrorist, you need to create a haystack first. You have to look in the haystack, so you've got to create it. They just turned that on its head. Reduce governmental secrecy to a necessary minimum by making it temporary instead of perpetual. Obama did mention a little bit of it. He did mention this in the course of his speech, that he would reduce the FISA records. And he didn't say how much. Right now, they're almost perpetual secret. Like I said, NSA's Minaret program is still largely secret, and that's 40-some years ago. So he didn't say how much, but if you don't reduce governmental secrecy, you're bound to have abuses. Increase independent oversight of and whistleblower protection in all agencies and national security contractors. Reduce, by the way, Edward Snowden did not have whistleblower protection. There's been many officials that said if he had just gone through the proper channels, he would have been protected as a whistleblower. Security contractors don't have a law that protects them as a whistleblower at all. It doesn't even exist. And of course, the other thing is, if you go to Congress, some of the people that actually knew this was going on, they would not have protected you. So there was, when the highest levels are the ones committing the wrongdoing, it's very difficult. The next one is reduce governmental corruption and revolving door conflicts of interest that Eisenhower was the first to warn about with respect to the military-industrial complex, and which are, in theory, prohibited by the Office of Government Ethics. I taught government ethics, and I taught law enforcement ethics. And one of the rules that we taught before 9/11 was that if you were working on a program in government, you couldn't quit the job or retire and then get a job the very next day in the program that was selling that back to the government. That was considered a complete conflict of interest. And for some reason now, it's just either being ignored or not enforced. Because we have directors of the NSA, CIA that go right, the generals, most of the generals, go right from one day working for government to the very next day making a profit from this, and then using their prior inside information and their network of friends and buddies. And of course, this is what they always say too about all military empires. Maybe they don't lose their wars. Maybe they don't really lose their battles. But what happens is they rot from the inside due to this terrible corruption. This is kind of like the Roman Empire. It maybe takes hundreds of years, but we are seeing this now to a high level degree. Is this kind of problem with conflicts of interest and governmental corruption. Oops, wrong one. I got to hit this one. Okay. And the last one is repeal. It's not the entire 1917 Espionage Act. It's just the last two provisions, D and E, that are being used to prosecute disclosures to the press and actually threatened to prosecute the press themselves for copying and retaining classified information. In theory, that E, which is the one that would cover the press, that even covers reading the press. So they have to prosecute every person who read the Washington Post. That's how broad this law is, 793E. But now that they're using it, you know, most government lawyers always thought this was unconstitutional. That's why it was not used. And now they are using it. They're threatening the press. Keith Alexander, who's the head of the NSA, about a month and a half ago, was giving an interview, and he says, we're going to have to do something to curtail the press. We're going to have to do something. He didn't spell out what he wanted to do. People know about the Fourth Amendment, which is the problem, the due process, and that you have to have a reasonable expectation of privacy. And so, you know, police can't come barging through your house, or they are not supposed to be able to listen in on you without probable cause. So we know the Fourth Amendment. The other amendment, the other real law that's at peril here is First Amendment. press, freedom of speech, and freedom of association. So both of those are right on the line. And now this quote is, I gave the commencement speech at the University of Minnesota's Law School in 2004. And this was part, my title of my commencement speech was called pedophagy. Does anyone know what pedophagy is? It's kind of an old term. It means in a lawyer who's a shyster. Okay, small time, cheating little things, but you're a shyster. And my title was "Don't Be a Pettifogger." And one or two of the people that were graduating had never heard this. But this quote, it seemed to us that the whole country, not just the government, had laid aside its normal pursuits and danced off to disport itself in a puddle of flummery, that we had become a nation of pettifoggers, of small-time tricksters, a padded lilliput whose citizens had simultaneously forgotten how to tell the truth, that the itch to equivocate had become as widespread and as irresistible as the temptation to fudge on taxes and so on and so forth. Maybe they had put something into the water. People would say that really applies today. But this was actually a quote by this Sam Adams, who was a CIA analyst during the Vietnam War, and he had counted the enemy troop strength in about 68, in about a year and a half. And the enemy, the North Vietnamese enemy, was twice as many as the generals. The head general was Westmoreland, but all the generals were reporting. And the reason that they were telling the American public that it was about 250,000, when really it was 500,000. The reason for that is because there were, how many years? 6 years into the war, 7 years. They were trying to tell the public that we're winning in Vietnam. We're making progress. We're killing so many. And if the enemy, if we were talking about this, if you have a war going on, especially drone bombing is this way. If you have a war, and yes, let's say you hit the target, but now 3 people got mad that joined the enemy because they weren't enemy before, but they became radicalized because their uncle or their neighbor was hit by a drone. Your enemy, it's hard to make progress. Now, your enemy is just going to grow, way up. Okay, so in Vietnam, they had this very simplistic that there were so many enemies, and you killed so many, you had to show the public you were making progress. And this is what Cronkite was reporting every night. Well, this CIA analyst, for several months, found out, he went to Vietnam, he counted all these different people under arms, etc., and he found out it was twice as much. And he had some military people on his side trying to get the truth out, and they had this big, behind closed doors debate about what they should tell the public. And Westmoreland et al. Won. At the end of the day, the CIA director crumbled. He let them go out and say it was such and such. There's actually a cable that came into the CIA that said, well, we can't tell them this because then they'll realize we're not making progress. So this all happens in about 68. The Tet Offensive occurred afterwards, which showed that this was a lot more serious than what the American people, and that's when Cronkite went out on the air and said the Vietnam War is unwinnable. So the end of the story was this poor Sam Adams then felt responsible that he had not been a whistleblower back then. There was no whistleblower protection in the 60s. But he could have been like Daniel Ellsberg. He could have gone to the papers and said, hey, they're lying. Look, I've got the proof that shows it's twice as many. Instead, he didn't. And, he went to a kind of an early death believing that he was responsible for the Vietnam War Memorial being twice as big. Because back around 68, there was only about 20-some thousand American deaths. But because it was promoted as it being winning, it went up to 58,000. So he carried this guilt that he should have told the truth about this. And this is all in this book called The War of Numbers. He eventually, after the war was starting to end, he went to like the 60 Minutes. And so he was on 60 Minutes when it was like nearly over. And then Westmoreland sued him for defamation. And Westmoreland, he had to back off because when they started to do the discovery, he was right. And so then Westmoreland had to drop his lawsuit. So what our group, we have a group called Sam Adams Award for Integrity and Intelligence. And it's comprised of CIA, NSA, I'm in it, FBI, and we gave our award to Edward Snowden this last year. We actually traveled to Moscow, met him briefly, and gave him our Sam Adams Award for Integrity and Intelligence. And this year we're giving the award to Chelsea Manning. So it's pretty, radical stuff to be giving awards to people that tell the truth in this kind of environment. But unfortunately, this pedophagy is the. I think that's it. Yep. Now, if there's any questions, I don't know how much longer we have, but I'd be happy to take some questions.
Yeah, we do. We have kept to just about 55 minutes, and we usually go at least till about 10 minutes out, so floor is open for questions, please.
I have a question on the Patriot Act. Is that one of the basis? Because after 9/11, that seemed to be Congress' reaction, and that seems to be the basis for collecting all this information.
Yeah, I did put it on there. And it could be a partial one. Let me explain something about the Patriot Act. The reason there's like a couple of reasons people know the Patriot Act. One is when it was kind of like total information awareness. When the Patriot Act passed, a month after 9/11, and most of the senators did read it. The only one that read it was Wisconsin, what's his name? Feingold. Feingold was the only one who had read it. It's 264 different provisions. One provision is this 215. And that is what now is being cited, just since 2008, is being cited as the basis for the telephone metadata collection, third-party record under 250. The Patriot Act itself is 264 different things, legal amendments to prior laws, changes, tweaks. Some of them haven't even been used. When I retired from the FBI in 2004, there were some provisions, as far as I know, were never even used that didn't even make a lot of sense. And they vary greatly. The reason people know about the Patriot Act is because there was a Bill of Rights Defense Committee that grew up and got about 300 cities around the United States. And they used a public awareness education program to, educate people about the Patriot Act. And so these resolutions, now when this was going on, I retired in 2004, I said, well, it's great that you're doing that, these 300, I think St. Paul might have been one. I think St. Paul passed a resolution that they were not going to follow the Patriot Act. I said, that's great, but you can't do that. The supremacy clause is a city cannot actually say, we're not following a federal law. So these were symbolic, and that's the reason people know the Patriot Act. The original basis of authority for this massive collection, as far as I know, there's a secret memo to this day, probably, I'm just guessing, was written by John Yoo, who's the same author in the Office of Legal Counsel, who wrote the torture memos. And so there was a group of attorneys in Office of Legal Counsel that redefined words and terms, and they also had this theory about executive power. Article 2, executive power, in a wartime, they call it emergency war presidency powers. And so lots of these legal authorities were based on the authorization to use military force. And that's actually right now, it's up for a vote. The authorization to use military force in Afghanistan, which was the first one that was made. Now there's more, there's the Iraq one that's still, they're both on the books, the AUMS. That was the original source. And so then, when they got found out in 2005 by the New York Times, and there was a scandal in the hotel room where some of the Department of Justice refused to sign off on Bush's warrantless monitoring. Then they reconfigured, they went back to the drawing board, then they put it under Section 215 of the Patriot Act. So at the present time, it's being justified by this one section of the Patriot Act. And yes, Sensenbrenner, who is one of the leaders, this is completely it's bipartisan, nonpartisan. Sensenbrenner was the author of the Patriot Act, one of the main authors, and he is horrified that 215 has been interpreted, the secret interpretation that gives it the right to collect these. That was never. The 215 reads that you can get a third-party record in a particular investigation. So everybody thought it was exactly as I was explaining. When you had suspicion, like a grand jury subpoena, it's based. You can't use a grand jury subpoena and go out and say, I want everyone's telephone records. You have to have an investigation going on a particular individual or whatever. And everyone believed that that's what that this would have been. No one would have thought that you would have used 215. Wyden, when they first got briefed about it, most of the senators went along. They, same with Congressman. Wyden was the one who didn't go along with it. And in fact, when he asked Clapper in that hearing, are you collecting, massive information on Americans, Clapper's like, you can't ask me that. You know you can't ask me that. Well, Wyden knew that this was going to be a problem. But that was a secret interpretation.
I thought he said actually no or not.
He did, right, because in his
Then
head,
he came back later and said, well, I might have misspoken.
yeah, he kind of half apologized now, but there's the argument that he has is that Wyden knew. Wyden wasn't seeking information. Wyden had been briefed about this. Wyden was just trying to put him on the spot. So that in his head, they gave him a license to not tell the truth. And you know what? This is just one example, by the way. When you have secret systems, this will go on all the time. Most of the times, you're not going to have a Wyden that's going to be challenging it in an open situation like this. They're just going to go with the torture and the black sites. There was no, Nancy Pelosi didn't ask anybody in an open committee hearing about black sites when she knew about it at the time. She never did this because most of them just go along with it. So yeah, changing the Patriot Act, and you wouldn't really have to change the reading. You just say that's not the interpretation. That might happen in court too. The one judge now has said that this is completely unconstitutional. And what he would say is that in a particular case, you could get a third-party information. You wouldn't even need probable cause. You could at least need some kind of reasonable suspicion. Yes?
So is Rand Paul's lawsuit against the NSA will presumably be thrown out because he has no standing, because he can't demonstrate that he is affected by the data collection because the data is secret, so that he does. Is this a catch-22 that nobody can get around?
The earlier cases were thrown out that way. There were, 3, 4, 5, I know of at least 3, 4 cases where a judge had 3 different technical ways that they could throw out a case. One was lack of standing. You can't prove. Hedges and others had a suit like this back when they said, well, you can't prove. Your authors, you can't prove that you've been spied on. There was a group of, out in California, Muslim group, that actually were involved in a criminal investigation, and by mistake, they got a document showing they'd been targeted. So they then had a pretty successful one. In that case, they could throw out for lack of standing, then they throw it out on state secrecy privilege. So there's like 3 different ways that the government, all your torture victims, even when they have complete proof that they have been held, they have proof they were innocent, our government throws out the lawsuit under state secrecy. My guess on Rand Paul's is, he would have standing, and he's got such a broad thing where it's all 300 million Americans that it's probably a little bit too dramatic, and he may be doing it more for show, realizing that he doesn't have much of a chance. There are 3 lawsuits right now, and the one that Judicial Watch, the conservative Judicial Watch, that was the judge that actually said it wasn't constitutional. The ACLU lost with their judge. And they said that judge just cited, the NSA and Michael Hayden and said it's fine. And so we don't know how the courts are going to work out. If it goes up to the Supreme Court, which it probably will, right now, it's kind of hard to say. I studied the Supreme Court because I would have to teach agents. I taught agents constitutional law for 13 years. And so I was always, trying to, Scalia was very law enforcement oriented. And so, if the case went up on knock and announce, you could kind of guess how he was going to come out. And we were always studying these things. Right now, it's getting harder to study. Scalia, who's considered the most, along with, Clarence Thomas and Alito and Roberts are considered conservatives. But Scalia has actually just given a speech where he said, the chances will all be put in concentration camp. Did anyone see this II. Not a concentration camp as much as a
Internment,
internment camp.
internment, Japanese
You know,
internment
he
camp.
used the Korematsu case. The Korematsu case where they put Japanese in internment camps out in California, but they didn't do it to the Germans, which inherently was, you know, if you're at war with Germany and Japan, you think you would have to do it with the Italians and the Germans as well, but they only did it with the Japanese. Anyway, Korematsu was still good law in some respects, and Scalia is warning that this could happen. So it's possible that maybe he kind of sees that this is, you know, really going against the founding fathers. I don't think anyone really knows how the Supreme Court would come down on it. And it's really what we need to do is not wait for courts to act. We need to all be doing more educating of fellow people. One common thing is people don't think it affects them. So if they think this is only spying, this is always being told. When Bush got found out about the surveillance in 2005, okay, the New York Times knew about Bush's warrantless spying because they had whistleblowers. They had Thomas Cam at the DOJ and they had others. Okay, so they knew this. They wrote their article and were not allowed to publish it for over a year because Cheney and Bush went in, scared them. They said, you can't do this. And so the election took place because if that article had come out before the election, it's possible Bush would not have been reelected. It was a pretty scathing thing. And that's, again, what forced the reconfiguring of the authorities for doing this. I lost my train of thought here on what I was talking about. Congress. Oh, wait for courts to act. Yeah. There was a chance then that they could have pushed and had to change. Instead, they went into Congress, it was in August of 2007, and got a temporary emergency power to continue. And actually, Klobuchar voted for it. You know, she voted, yes, fine. She was only 6 months in. You know, that actually completely violates the Constitution, what happened. And once it got temporary, they eased into it, everybody forgot, and then it just went on full force again. And so we should be all challenging this now and trying to teach people. The idea that it won't happen to you, like Frank Church himself was one of the people monitored. And there is some notion, one of the NSA whistleblowers said that the Congress was also targeted at the start. He said that they had generals were under surveillance. If you think about Petraeus, sex scandals, all of the sex scandals in Washington, D.C. Well, FBI's J. Edgar Hoover, that's where he got his power from. Spying and collecting personal data on congresspersons, on presidents. They said at one point that Hoover was more powerful than the presidents because he would go up to these figures and say, just have to let you know we have an investigation going. Well, the person immediately would know, oh, you got me. And usually it was something about a sex scandal. Petraeus, when he was having his one affair that got found out, he was actually conducting spy. He and the girlfriend were actually doing, had code names where they were contacting each other because Petraeus knew about this massive dragnet. So, I mean, if you can imagine that our own officials are also under the same thing. That's what I told Klobuchar. Why the heck would you have given an okay to this? Don't you realize you and other Congress people are going to be the first people because you have some power. You're going to be the first people that are going to be spying. And that's what's happened in the past. So, and we don't know, then there was a later article saying that somehow Congress got exemptions so that they realize this and somehow they've taken their numbers out so that they're not caught up in this dragnet. If you think about democracy and checks and balances, you know, that kind of makes sense. But then on the other hand, it doesn't make sense because everybody else is in the dragnet except for them. So. Yes?
Can you say something about the Musawi case?
Yeah, the Musawi case, I wrote an op-ed when he was prosecuted against the so-called use of intelligence because he was a perfectly good example. He And he was convicted. So the argument that you can't use our old due process and that somehow you have to bend the Constitution, the Constitution is not a suicide pact, we have to get rid of the old guidelines and be able to do these things freer or whatever, collect massive data, is completely wrong. The only successful case that we had being prosecuted somebody was the Moussaoui case. And he actually took a long time. There were some irregularities in the case of that prosecution, but it was still much better than what they did with Guantanamo. Okay, Guantanamo has 86 people who were put there because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone offered a bounty. In some cases, I have some military folks, they would just drive a car into a town and they would say, we're taking you for a ride, so people would jump in and they'd take them and send them off to Guantanamo. So the people on Guantanamo, huge percentage, were just completely innocent. That's how bad this is, again, the system. That's that triangle just turned upside down. Not a shred of evidence, but throw away the key, because now they've been locked up for 10, 11 years. The Moussaoui case, by contrast, a lot of information. The first people that called our office were whistleblowers from the flight school. They went against their bosses to call into the FBI to say, we have the most suspicious flight student we've ever had, he paid in cash, can't give an explanation, wants to do these, learn these flying maneuvers. He doesn't even have a private pilot's license, told us it was for a thrill. I mean, the pilot instructors had never seen anyone so suspicious. And our agents then sent leads over to Paris and to the UK. The Paris French people immediately sent information back that said that Moussaoui, French-Moroccan, had been recruiting for Chechen leader Ibn Khattab. Well, that April memo said that Osama bin Laden was heavily entwined with Ibn Khattab. I mean, the amount of evidence that existed, and then the agents sought to search his personal effects and his laptop. And they went through this process, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act secret court process. And our FBI stopped it. They would not let it even be tried over in the FISA court. They wouldn't even take it to the FISA court, even though there was this much information. That's what my memo was about. Because there was probable cause, and not only was there probable cause, but the day of 9/11, as soon as we saw what was happening, we knew it was connected. And sure enough, when you search his personal effects, the numbers, there's a fingerprint on a money receipt that connects right up with the other hijackers. So it was one of these missed chances. And again, this is this excuse given that that you couldn't have done it, which it actually had all the information. There are many of these. This is just one. The worst one, even worse than Moussaoui, were two hijackers that they had been following since a meeting in Kuala Lumpur where the CIA had monitored, and they were on their terrorist list. And they came into California. And the CIA never told the FBI that these two terrorist hijackers were in California. If they had, they could have found them right away. One of them was they were staying with an FBI informant. So they could have found them. I mentioned beforehand, that one of the programs of this massive data collection is following your cell phone. So it's cell phone location. Okay? Think about, you don't even know the people you're passing by. If you were only going by location information, the number of people that could be murderers, it could be, all kinds of people that you're going to be in a hotel room next to somebody. Of course, they're strangers. You have no idea. So the cell phone location, you can't even imagine the humongous, I can't even imagine how anything could be useful like this. Here's the kicker. Before 9/11, some of the hijackers were staying in a Fleabag Hotel next to the NSA. And they actually had interceptions that were about the bombing and stuff. They all listened to those afterwards, but they had actually gathered those beforehand. There's just so much. Again, Chapter 8 in this thing is called The System Was Blinking Red. There's so much. So the answer here is to do the job. It's to force people to read if there's important intelligence. There should be some kind of accountability where you have to sign off that you, like Bush when he got briefed, that you have to sign off so that afterwards I didn't listen to that, I didn't get briefed. Most of our Phoenix memo that said that suspects were training in flight schools are supervisors whose names are on it. It they never read it afterwards. Okay, so one of the easy fixes to do a better job would be simply to find out what makes sure that things get read. That's the first step, read, then shared properly, and then acted on. So there should be some mechanisms. That would have been the very easy thing based on all of the failures of 9/11. Instead of starting a war on Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11, rounding up people for Guantanamo, all the things that occurred, which are just completely counterproductive, including the massive data collection, which is now helping and enabling. It's worse than being ineffective. It's actually counterproductive. It's actually hurting the ability to find the real terrorists. I have an op-ed I wrote, so if I missed anything, it's called, I wrote it for CNN about 3 days after the first disclosure, and so if you Google it, it's called Massive Spying on Americans is Outrageous. And, I wrote it so quick because it was CNN was only giving me 1 day to write it. And I quick did it, and I looked it over, and the only thing I think I would change now after all these months is I wrote massive spying on Americans is outrageous. And I wanted to, of course, tell Americans, but turns out it's the entire world. And it's Americans are included. And I think it's important to realize that we're not excluded just simply because we're in this, situation. We're not excluded, but it actually is everyone in the whole world. So.
Thank you very much.